You ever catch yourself thinking about someone you haven't spoken to in weeks, or replaying a sentence someone said just once, but it echoes over and over in your head? You don't know why. It wasn't loud, it wasn't sharp, it was timed, and that made it lethal. And now you can't let it go. That thought, that craving, that emotional itch that shows up. When it's too quiet, it feels like yours. But maybe it isn't. Maybe it was installed, not by force, not through argument, but through design. Because thoughts don't stay in your mind because they're true. They stay because they loop. And loops don't need logic. They just need timing, emotion, and silence. You're not remembering something because it mattered. You're remembering it because someone knew exactly when to say it and when to disappear. That's how the deepest influence works. It doesn't sound like control. It doesn't look like manipulation. It feels like your own idea. That's why it's dangerous. The most powerful ideas don't demand attention. They hide in the background, replaying like a hum in your subconscious, waiting for the right emotional cue to surface again. And every time they do, they get stronger, more natural, more real, until one day you act on them and you call it intuition. But it wasn't intuition, it was implantation, looped, primed, reinforced by silence and suggestion. This video is going to show you how that works. Not to protect yourself, but to do it intentionally. You'll learn how to plant a thought in someone's mind without them noticing. Make it repeat under the surface, triggered by context. And let that repetition turn into craving without ever asking for anything. You won't need to beg for attention. You won't need to sell yourself. You won't need to speak twice. You'll just say the right thing at the right moment and disappear, because the echo you leave behind will do the rest. So, if you've ever wondered how some people become unforgettable, how their words get stuck inside your head for weeks, this is why. It wasn't what they said. It was how they embedded it. And how they made you repeat it to yourself. Let's begin. You think your brain seeks truth, that it filters information based on logic, clarity, accuracy. But it doesn't. Your brain doesn't follow what's true. It follows what's repeated, what's emotional, what's unfinished. Because repetition isn't noise. It's permission. It's like a fingerprint pressed into your nervous system, subtle but permanent. It tells your nervous system, this matters. Replay it again. You've seen this before in advertising, in conversations, in trauma. Something loops dash. Not because you chose it, but because the rhythm locked in. This is why certain phrases haunt you. Not because they were profound, but because they were delivered just enough times to embed. And once embedded, they don't ask for attention. They just wait until you're tired, alone, triggered, quiet enough to hear them, start spinning again. And here's the twist. Your brain can't tell the difference between you thinking it and someone else planting it long before. Because once it loops, you own it. You don't question its origin, you just feel the pull. This is why emotionally charged loops are more dangerous than aggressive persuasion. Because they bypass argument, they bypass choice, they go straight into rhythm. Let me show you something simple. A friend says once, "People always leave you, huh?" You brush it off. But that night, you replay it. Not because you believe it, but because the rhythm fits something unresolved. And now, every time someone pulls away, that phrase whispers, that's not coincidence. That's neurological anchoring. Your brain craves closure. And when a phrase touches an open wound, an unresolved pattern. It loops, not because it's right, but because it's incomplete. The mind doesn't archive unfinished business. It replays it. That's how thought implants become cravings. They don't force your belief. They saturate your cognition. Until one day, you start acting on the idea you didn't even know was growing inside you. This is how the world trains you. Through algorithms, through drama, through emotional impressions that echo just long enough to become truth. So if you want to control someone's attention, you don't need to be brilliant. You just need to be rhythmic, consistent, unresolved, and tied to something they already feel, because repetition is the doorway to ownership. And ownership is how influence becomes identity. Your brain doesn't follow truth. It follows loops. And if you can write the loop, you never need to convince them again. Repetition gets a thought inside, but emotion locks it in place. Because the brain doesn't just remember words, it remembers how they felt. And when a concept echoes at just the right emotional frequency, it doesn't just become familiar, it becomes desired. Here's how it works. A phrase hits you, not with force, but with timing. You only miss me when it's quiet. It doesn't demand attention, but it leaves a mark. Now every time silence appears, your mind connects it. You don't just remember them, you feel them: longing, nostalgia, need. That's not memory, that's looped craving, because repetition tied to emotion activates dopamine circuitry. It's not memory, it's chemical nostalgia disguised as need. The loop becomes chemically rewarded, and now the idea replays, not because it's important, but because it's pleasurable to the brain. You think you're drawn to a person, or a memory, or a decision, but often you're just chasing the echo of the emotional imprint they attached to a concept inside you. Think of it like a trigger response system. A concept gets introduced. You only feel safe when I'm around. You brush it off. But next time you feel unsafe, your brain replays it, and you crave the association, not because it's truth, but because it now feels like resolution. That's how addiction works. Not just to substances, but to patterns, to stories, to identity frames disguised as comfort. And the scariest part, you don't realize it's happening, because the thought doesn't demand obedience, it just returns at the same cue, over and over, until your nervous system builds a habit of craving it. This is concept echo, a single idea carefully framed, tied to the right emotional window, and repeated just enough to install itself as a low-level hunger. You're not thinking about it anymore, you're feeling the need to revisit it. And that's how thoughts become cravings. They aren't loud, they're embedded, and they don't need your belief, just your repetition. So if you want to implant desire, you don't need to sell it. You don't need to repeat it forcefully. You just need to echo it at the emotional moment. That binds it to their biology, because once that echo pairs with a dopamine trigger, it no longer feels like your influence. It feels like their own longing. Craving doesn't start in the heart. It starts in the loop. And if you can shape the loop, you control what they feel drawn to, long after you're gone. If you want to implant a thought, one they can't shake, one that replays long after you're gone, you don't push, you loop. But not just any loop. A designed loop with timing, spacing, emotion, and silence. This is the four-phase method. 1. Seed. 2. Delay. 3. Repeat. 4. Embed. Let's break it down. 1. Seed. Plant the first impression. You drop the thought, casually, effortlessly, without tension, not as a command, not as advice, just as an observation. Funny how some people only feel lonely in silence. That's the seed. No pressure, just a flicker of context. 2. Delay. Step back. Let it breathe. Don't hammer the idea. Don't repeat it right away. Silence is fertilizer. The brain remembers what's unresolved, what doesn't immediately close the loop. While they process it, you say nothing. And that quiet is where the thought starts to loop on its own. 3. Repeat, reintroduce it subtly, when they're most receptive. Now, in a later moment, you bring it back. But lightly, rhythmically. You ever notice how silence brings up things you didn't want to feel? Now the brain says, wait. I've heard this before. That familiarity triggers recognition, and recognition triggers attachment. Now the thought doesn't feel random. It feels real, because it has rhythm. 4. Embed. Link the idea to an emotional state. This is where the loop gets permanent. You pair the concept with a moment of vulnerability, stillness, tension, or softness. Silence feels different when someone's missing. Right. Suddenly your idea becomes anchored, not as a sentence, but as a sensation. Next time they feel quiet, lonely, reflective, the loop returns. Not because they remembered you, but because the emotion is now wired to your thought. That's how it works. One line, one echo, one pattern, now locked in beneath awareness. And they'll think it's themselves. They'll replay it at night, in traffic, in quiet spaces, after conversations, not knowing you planted it on purpose. You don't need to repeat it forever. You just need to install it once, correctly, with space, with silence, with timing, and then let it haunt on its own. Funny how every time you think of silence, it's me. That's the sentence. Harmless. But once looped with mood, it becomes addictive. And now you live there, in their mental background, rent-free. So remember this. If you can echo the right concept, you live in their mental real estate without ever asking for space. After you plant the loop, don't explain it. Don't follow up. Don't try to drive the point home. Withdraw. Because silence isn't absence. It's pressure. It's extra space. When done right, silence becomes a mirror the other person projects their thoughts onto. They don't hear your voice. They hear their own replaying what you implied, but never finished. That's how reinforcement happens, not through repetition from you, but through internal repetition from them. Here's the psychology. The brain doesn't like open threads. It craves closure. It wants stories to end, ideas to resolve, questions to be answered. So when you say something potent, then go quiet. You trigger cognitive tension. That tension seeks relief. And if you don't provide it, the brain loops in search of it. It replays the phrase again and again trying to finish the pattern, trying to interpret what you meant, trying to decide what you really think. And in that effort, your words gain depth, meaning weight, not because they were profound, but because you never closed the loop. That's what makes them echo. Think about it. Someone once said something to you, short, vague, even cryptic, and then just stopped talking, didn't clarify, didn't smile, didn't change the subject. And that silence, it pulled you in. You thought about it for hours, days, maybe years, not because of what they said, but because of what they didn't say next. That's the tactic. Say less. Then say nothing. Then stay present only as a question mark in their head. The void becomes the amplifier. The mystery becomes the loop. The unfinished becomes the obsession. You create a vacuum the other person fills with their own mental energy. And the more they fill it, the more emotionally attached they become to decoding what you never clarified. That's not conversation. That's architected tension. You don't need to push the loop. You just need to give it room to expand inside their mind. And silence is the most fertile soil for that expansion. So instead of reinforcing your message through words, reinforce it through absence. Plant, pause, disappear, and let them do the replaying for you. Because influence doesn't require explanation, it requires presence, then withdrawal. And the best loops aren't followed by clarity, they're followed by silence. So remember this, what you don't say is what they'll repeat for you. You don't need to stay on someone's mind by chasing them, or messaging them, or showing up all the time. You just need to connect your presence to something they can't escape. Because if you can tie your loop to a context they experience every day, you don't need to remind them. The world does it for you. This is trigger linking. And it's how subtle thoughts become automatic recall. Here's the method. Find something they encounter often, a time of day, a sound, a setting, a mood, a void, and pair your message, your phrase, your tone with that trigger. Then disappear. Let the environment replay you in their subconscious. Example: you once text them, "I only reach out when the room gets quiet." Harmless. But now, every time they're alone, every time things go still, they feel the itch, the association, not just silence. You, inside the silence. They don't even notice it happening. They just feel a pull, a memory, a loop linked to the context they live in. And now, your thought is embedded in their routine. The beauty of this, they'll think it's them, their timing, their feeling, their random need to reconnect. But it's not random. It's coded. Because the most powerful ideas don't announce themselves. They arrive in sync with something familiar. And the brain accepts them without resistance. That's why nostalgia works. Why certain songs trigger emotions. Why smells can bring you back years in an instant. It's not the thing, it's what the thing was paired with. So the strategy is simple. When you drop your thought, anchor it to a natural trigger already built into their daily rhythm. It could be a time you always overthink at midnight. A sound Funny how this song always finds you when you're unsure. A state loneliness always makes you remember the wrong people. A visual, that dull kitchen light, always makes you pause. Say it once, then vanish. Now, every time that moment returns, so do you. Not because you said more, but because the context carries your voice on its own. And now, they're not remembering you. They're experiencing you as part of their world. That's how you install yourself without needing access. You ride the trigger, not the conversation. So remember this, you don't need to be there. You just need to be linked to what always is. The most powerful thoughts aren't the ones you hear. They're the ones you think you came up with. That's the final layer of the loop. Reverse authorship. It means letting someone believe the thought you installed was their own idea. Because once that happens, resistance disappears. Doute disappear. Attachment deepens. Not because the idea was logical, but because it felt authentic, internal, familiar. It felt like them, and we always trust our own voice more than anyone else's. Here's what happens neurologically. When a loop repeats enough times, triggered by context, echoed through silence, rewarded by emotion, the brain begins to lose track of where it started. It no longer remembers who said what, when, or why. It just knows. This idea keeps showing up in my own mind, so it must be mine. And once it crosses that threshold, you don't have to reinforce it. They will. They'll talk about it, act on it, defend it, protect it, not as something they heard, but as something they realized. That's the shift. You didn't convince them. You didn't push. You didn't debate. You looped. You linked. You waited. And now, they're carrying your thought like a revelation. Example, you never say you're afraid of stillness. You just ask. Do you ever notice how loud your thoughts get when everything goes quiet? Then you vanish. Now that thought lingers. It replays. And days later, they say to someone else, I don't like silence. It makes me overthink. And just like that, they've absorbed your implantation as self-awareness. That's not coincidence. That's mental authorship reversal. Because influence doesn't always feel external. When done right, it feels like intuition. And what people call intuition, they don't question. They follow. Blindly. Confidently. That's the danger. And that's the opportunity. So your job is not to own the thought. Your job is to orchestrate it. Then let it fall into their hands as if it always belonged there. And when they act on it, you say nothing. Because the more silent you stay, the more they believe they arrived there alone. So here's the final key. Once they believe the thought was theirs, the loop becomes permanent. It doesn't just live in their mind. It roots in their identity. And from that point forward, you don't need access. You already live in their inner dialogue. You don't need to control what people do. You don't need to chase, convince, or persuade. You just need to control the thought. They can't stop thinking. Because once you do that, their behavior follows. Their emotions follow. Their attention follows. Not by force, but by mental gravity. And here's the truth. The world forgets loud voices. but it never forgets the echoes that replay in silence. You don't need to dominate the room. You don't need to be present in their life. You don't even need to be remembered by name. Just become the echo. The one idea that loops in their quiet moments. That's the deepest form of influence. Not persuasion, but repetition without presence. Let them go on with their day. Let them scroll, talk, move. But when the noise fades and the stillness returns, let your idea rise. Uninvited, indéniable, unshakable. Because true power isn't being at the front of their mind. It's being in the background every time they pause. Every time they question. Every time they feel something without knowing why. So here's your move. Don't shout. Don't overshare. Don't explain too much. Just plant. Wait. Disappear. Let the mind you touched do the rest. Because once an idea echoes in the right emotional chamber, it doesn't need a push. It becomes its own engine. And the person you influenced will believe it came from them. They'll carry it, defend it, fail it, not as a memory of you, but as a part of themselves. That's not manipulation. That's psychological design. And it's more lasting than any confrontation or command. So remember this, you don't need to fight for attention. Just become the echo that loops in their silence. Start crafting your loops. Choose the phrase. Say it once. Say it right. Then vanish. Let the silence install you. Because the deepest control isn't the voice they listen to when you're near, it's the thought they can't escape when you're gone. Drop mic. The sharpest weapon is the one they call their own. And the echo you planted will never stop repeating.